In Regency England, a lady may marry for security, but she does not always expect to marry into secrets. When a governess accepts a desperate proposal, she steps into a crumbling estate, a guarded heart, and a door that must never be opened. This is the fully illustrated and remastered edition of The Earl's Secret Bride. Stay with us until the end for a special bonus chapter. The Earl's Secret Bride begins now. Chapter 1. A Desperate Proposal. The ballroom of Fernleigh House blazed with light, as though determined to outshine the stars themselves. Wax candles stood in regimented rows upon towering chandeliers, their flames mirrored by gilt-framed looking glasses and glittering against painted ceilings where cupids cavorted among clouds. Every polished surface reflected brilliance until the very air seemed golden. It was a scene designed to overwhelm, and it succeeded. Music surged, a lively country dance drawing couples into neat patterns. Silks rippled in every hue, rose, emerald, sapphire, and ivory, while ostrich plumes trembled above glossy curls, powdered or darkened with pomade. The air was a mingling of beeswax, roses, perfume, and the savoury promise of supper waiting in the adjoining hall. Charlotte Darrow kept to the edges, as she always did. Her gown was dove grey muslin, modest in cut, relieved only by a faint ribbon of pale blue satin threaded at the neckline. It was neat, serviceable, and unremarkable amid a blaze of Parisian silks. Her gloves, carefully darned at the fingertips, fitted well enough, but she saw the faint difference between her hands and those of the ladies glittering around her. Her slippers bore the quiet scuff of long use. She carried her fan like a shield, opening and closing it without conscious thought as she observed. Her dark hair had been braided and wound into a modest knot at the nape of her neck, with only a single rebellious curl escaping to soften her temple. No diamonds winked at her throat, only a simple string of pale glass beads, chosen because they caught light kindly in shadow. No one asked her to dance. She did not expect they would. Her charge, Lady Harbury's eldest daughter, pale and nervous in rose-pink silk, clung to her mother's side, too shy to accept partners. Charlotte stood ready, steadying the girl with a glance when she faltered. She was there in her professional capacity. Companion, governess, shadow, and she knew her place. Yet she could not help but overhear, near the supper table, two matrons conversed in tones, pitched not quite low enough for discretion. "The Earl of Ravensleigh stands alone again," murmured one, fluttering a fan of painted ivory. "Do you suppose it is pride, or only poverty?" Her companion, heavy in diamonds, arched a penciled brow. "What does it matter? A man whose steward pawns the silver is scarcely fit to claim a bride. I heard the stables at Ravensleigh have not seen fresh straw in a year." Charlotte's gaze flicked across the ballroom. There he was, Sebastian Harrow, Earl of Ravensleigh, a solitary figure at the edge of the supper table. He wore a coat of black superfine, the cut impeccable though faintly worn at the cuffs. His waistcoat of midnight blue silk caught and held the candlelight with a subtle gleam. His cravat, of fine linen, knotted with careless haste. His boots were polished, though the leather carried the faint dullness of long use. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his dark hair unruly enough to hint at defiance. His face was striking in its sternness. A strong jaw, cheekbones cut by shadow, brows drawn as if perpetually considering some heavy matter. He spoke to no one. He stood, glass in hand, surveying the room with eyes so piercing that even the most garrulous dowagers faltered beneath them. Charlotte's gaze lingered too long, and for the briefest instant his eyes found hers. Her breath caught. Heat rose, unbidden, to her cheeks. She turned away at once, fan fluttering too quickly, scolding herself. What folly, to imagine he would look twice at her. She was no heiress draped in silk, no diamond of the first water. She was a governess, tolerated on the edge of the crowd. The music shifted, the orchestra striking the strains of a slower quadrille. Couples drifted toward the floor. Lady Harbury's daughters were swept into the dance at last, leaving Charlotte momentarily free. She slipped from the ballroom, her pulse still unsettled, and into the side corridor lined with ancestral portraits. Here the air was cooler. She drew a steadying breath, folding her hands together. It was always like this. The press of finery, the glitter of expectation, the constant reminder that she was both within society and outside it. A footstep echoed. She turned and froze. The Earl himself had followed. Up close, he was taller still, his shoulders filling the narrow corridor, his expression one of intent focus. His boots struck the marble with deliberate tread. "Miss Darrow," he said, voice low and rough-edged. "Forgive the intrusion." She curtsied, heart thrumming. "My lord." He did not waste time with pleasantries. He spoke as a man pushed to a precipice. "I require a wife." The words seemed to hang. Impossible. Charlotte stared, scarcely breathing. I beg your pardon?" His gaze did not waver. "Ravensleigh is imperiled. Without marriage, without some appearance of stability, my house will fall. I have no patience for simpering ladies who wilt at crumbling plaster. But you—" His eyes swept her gown, her bearing, her unflinching composure. "You are different. You know what it is to go without. You would not despise me for the truth." Her fan trembled in her grip. "My lord, I am a governess. You cannot possibly mean—" "I mean precisely that." He stepped closer, though careful not to crowd her. "A marriage of convenience. You would gain security no governess's post could ever match. I would gain a wife who understands necessity. It need be nothing more." Her pulse leapt in her throat. "And what of affection?" His jaw tightened. For the first time the granite mask cracked. His eyes softened, only slightly, but enough to reveal the man behind the Earl. "I cannot promise it." Her heart twisted. In his tone she heard not indifference, but a man who had been burned before. She thought of her own life. The endless cycle of households, the polite dismissals, the children she raised but could never claim, the loneliness of belonging nowhere. She thought of her quiet longing to anchor herself. Her voice emerged softer than she intended. "Why me?" "Because when I look at you," he said, each word deliberate, "I see someone who will not falter when the walls tremble." The music swelled faintly beyond the ballroom doors, a waltz winding upward. Charlotte's breath caught. She stood at the edge of something vast and unknown. And then she leapt. "Yes, my lord. I will be your wife." Relief flickered, quickly masked, but there. He inclined his head, as though sealing the contract. "Tomorrow," he said, "at dawn, before tongues may wag." Her knees weakened. Tomorrow, by dawn, she would be a countess. Between duty and desire, Charlotte stepped onto a path that would bind her fate forever to the Earl of Ravensleigh. And nothing would ever be the same. Chapter 2. The Wedding at Dawn. The hour was not yet 6 when Charlotte awoke. A faint blush of light slipped between her curtains, gentle as a whisper. The house was silent, servants not yet stirring, only the muffled creak of timbers settling in the chill. She rose from her narrow bed, heart drumming, and crossed to where her gown lay ready. It was not silk, nor gauze, nor satin, only white sprigged muslin, pressed neatly, with a narrow ribbon of lavender at the waist. Yet when she lifted it and stepped inside, fastening the ties with steady fingers, something within her shifted. Against the smooth fairness of her skin, the pale fabric glowed. The lavender ribbon drew attention to the slender line of her figure. The gown was plain, but in its plainness, there was honesty, and in its honesty, a kind of beauty. She braided her dark hair into a crown, glossy in the dawn's half-light, and pinned it firmly. A single pearl comb, her one treasure, a gift from her father. She slid beside her temple. It gleamed softly, catching the rich depth of her eyes. Her gloves were of kid leather, plain white but fitted close, softening the shape of her hands. She looked into the glass and almost did not know herself. The governess, the companion in borrowed chambers, was gone. In her place stood a woman solemn and radiant, with a quiet loveliness that came not from ornament, but from grace. For the first time in many years, Charlotte felt, if not beautiful, then seen. The door opened softly. Lady Harbury entered, wrapped in her morning gown, her expression tender. "My dear," she murmured, pausing to study Charlotte. "I had not realized until this moment how very handsome you are." "He will see it too. Do not doubt it." Charlotte lowered her gaze, cheeks warming. Beauty had never been her armor. Yet this morning, it settled about her like a fragile mantle. Outside, the dawn air was crisp, mist still curling along the hedges. The modest black carriage waited, its wheels damp with dew. And there, Sebastian. He stood straight-backed beside it, dressed in a dark blue coat of superfine, a waistcoat of black silk, his cravat stark against the severity of his features. His boots gleamed with fresh polish, his hair, unruly as ever, curled against his temple, catching a glimmer of light. He did not wear a flower in his lapel, nor any jewelled pin. Yet he looked as though he had stepped into his role centuries past. Solemn, unyielding, carved from shadow and stone. His gaze swept to her. For an instant, his composure faltered. He had expected plainness. He had chosen her for it. Instead, he beheld a woman with eyes like polished jet, hair rich as sable, a presence luminous in simplicity. He did not speak it, but something tightened in his chest as he helped her into the carriage. The ride to the parish church was brief. Neither spoke. Charlotte kept her gloved hands folded, the plain muslin of her skirts brushing the leather seat. Sebastian stared forward, his jaw firm. The silence was not hostile. It was weighted, both of them aware of the irrevocability of what they rode to do. The church stood small and old, its stones damp with moss, its windows pale with dawn. The vicar, a kindly man with spectacles, waited by the altar with two witnesses. Lady Harbury's butler in his livery, and Sebastian's steward, solemn and stiff. Inside, candles flickered against the chill. The scent of wax and damp stone filled the air. Charlotte walked beside Sebastian up the short aisle, the sound of her slippers muted against worn flagstones. The vicar opened the book, his voice, steady but kind, filled the little nave. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here." Charlotte's pulse thrummed. She repeated the words when bidden, her voice soft but clear. "To have and to hold. For better, for worse." Each vow fell from her lips like a stone into still water, rippling outward. When Sebastian spoke, his voice was deep and unwavering, carrying through the shadows as if he had rehearsed the lines in silence for years. The ring, plain gold, heavy with warmth, slid onto her finger. Sebastian's hand lingered as he released it, his gaze flicking to her face as though startled anew by her beauty at such close distance. "You are wed," intoned the vicar. "What God hath joined together, let no man put asunder." The silence after was profound. Charlotte's breath caught. She was no longer a governess. She was Countess of Ravensleigh. Sebastian offered his arm. "My lady," he said quietly. It was the first time he had called her that. The words were gruff, almost awkward, yet in them she felt a tremor, as though the title suited her more than either had expected. Outside, the sky had brightened. Mist thinned. Shafts of sun broke over the hedges. Their carriage waited, wheels damp, horses snorting in the cold. Charlotte lifted her skirts and settled inside. Sebastian followed, his shoulder brushing hers. The silence remained, but in it, she thought she sensed not only gravity, but something else. A fragile respect, unspoken. Back at Harbury House, a modest breakfast was laid in a private parlour. The table bore a plain white cloth, but the dishes were thoughtfully chosen. Fresh bread, still warm, butter golden and soft, ham baked with cloves, sliced thin, eggs scrambled with herbs from the garden, a bowl of strawberries glistening with sugar, and a pot of strong tea, steaming richly. Charlotte removed her gloves, her new ring gleaming against pale fingers. She took bread and butter, her hands trembling, grounding herself in the ritual of eating. Sebastian served himself ham and eggs, his movements efficient, precise. For long minutes, they ate in silence. Only the clink of cutlery against china filled the room. At last Sebastian spoke. His voice was steady, but low. "You will find Ravensleigh no easy home. The roof leaks. The staff are few. The accounts will trouble you." Charlotte lifted her eyes. "And yet you have married me into it." He held her gaze. For the first time, she thought she saw a flicker of vulnerability. "Because you will not turn away." She swallowed, her throat tight. Did he see only endurance in her, or did he notice that her beauty, modest though it was, came from resilience, from never bowing when the world pressed down? A knock interrupted. Lady Harbury bustled in, cheeks flushed. "Well then, it is done. How grave you both look. Smile, my dear, you are a bride, and a very lovely one. Come, let the day not be all solemnity." Charlotte managed a smile, shy but true. Sebastian inclined his head, his mouth twitching, as though he might do the same. By noon, trunks were strapped to the carriage. Charlotte changed into a travelling habit of dark green wool, fitted close at the waist, with a bonnet trimmed in lavender ribbon. Her new ring glinted in the morning sun as she smoothed her skirts. She climbed into the carriage beside her husband. This time, when the wheels jolted forward and the countryside spread before them, Charlotte did not feel herself a governess on yet another journey to serve others. She was a wife, a countess. And whether Ravensleigh would prove ruin or refuge, she would meet it head high, her beauty no longer something overlooked, but part of the strength she carried with her into her new life. Charlotte left the church a governess no longer, but a countess whose beauty was bound not in jewels or lace, but in a quiet grace her husband could neither ignore nor easily forget. Chapter 3. The arrival at Ravensleigh. The journey was long, the road unkind, but Charlotte did not falter. Seated in the Earl's dark travelling carriage, upholstered in faded blue velvet, she held her gloved hands in her lap and fixed her gaze on the changing countryside. Each mile carried her further from the familiar lanes of Harbury and deeper into the life she had chosen. Her travelling habit of dark green wool, chosen for its practicality, brushed neatly about her ankles as the carriage jolted. A lavender ribbon trimmed her bonnet, catching the faint light that pierced the clouds. Beside her, Sebastian sat with shoulders squared, his coat of navy broadcloth buttoned against the chill, his profile stern against the window's pale light. He had spoken little since they left, save to ask if she was warm enough. His voice brisk, almost awkward in its courtesy. The villages they passed bore signs of the season's change. Hedgerows bare, fields tilled and waiting, smoke curling from cottages where children chased hens through yards. Now and again, Charlotte glimpsed the flicker of eyes turned towards the carriage. An earl's conveyance was still a sight to note, even if whispers of Ravensleigh's decline had travelled far. As the day wore on, the skies grew heavy with cloud. The horses strained, the wheels splashed through mud. Charlotte felt each bump rattle up her spine. Yet her resolve did not waver. She straightened her back, refusing to appear weary. At last, as twilight pressed low, the land changed. Wooded hills rose, thick with oak and beech, their bare branches etched like ink against the fading sky. The road narrowed, climbing toward a ridge. And then, rounding a final bend, Ravensleigh appeared. Charlotte drew in a sharp breath. The manor loomed against the dying light, vast, grey-stoned, its wings sprawling as if straining to hold together. Tall chimneys pierced the sky. Turrets, once proud, bore streaks of soot and lichen. The grand central facade, with its carved stone falcons, was darkened, the windows reflecting only gloom. Ivy clung in ragged patches. The gates of wrought iron twisted into falcon motifs, stood rusted and creaking. It was magnificent still, but magnificence tarnished. Dignity worn to the bone. Sebastian's jaw tightened as he watched her reaction. "It is worse than you expected," he said quietly. "No," Charlotte replied, though her voice faltered. She steadied it. "It is what I expected. A house that waits for hands willing to love it again." His eyes flicked toward her, sharp, unreadable. Something in his expression softened, quickly masked. But there, the carriage rattled across the courtyard cobbles. Servants emerged, their number small. A butler, tall and thin, bowed stiffly. A housekeeper in worn black curtsied. Behind them, a handful of maids, a footman, and a stable lad stood uncertainly, their eyes darting between Sebastian and Charlotte. "This is Lady Ravensleigh," Sebastian announced, his tone curt, almost defensive. "You will show her proper respect." The housekeeper dipped again, but Charlotte sensed hesitation. She met the woman's gaze directly and offered a gentle smile. "I am pleased to be here. We shall learn together how best to serve this house." A flicker of surprise crossed the woman's face, followed by the faintest nod. Inside, the entrance hall bore the grandeur of centuries. High ceilings coffered in oak, a grand staircase sweeping upward, portraits of stern ancestors in gilt frames. Yet the air was chill, the hearth stood unlit, dust clung to corners, the carpet threadbare at the edges. Charlotte's slippered feet echoed on stone. She removed her bonnet, smoothing her hair. A maid took her cloak hesitantly. "You must be weary," Sebastian said. "A meal awaits, such as can be contrived." In the dining hall, a long table stretched beneath a chandelier. Once it must have glittered with plate and crystal. Now the spread was meagre but earnest. A joint of roast mutton sat at the centre, flanked by boiled turnips and carrots, a loaf of coarse bread, and a dish of apples stewed with cinnamon. A single decanter of claret stood beside plain pewter cups. Charlotte seated herself at Sebastian's side, hands folded in her lap. The butler served in silence. She took a portion of mutton, a spoon of turnips, a slice of bread. She chewed thoughtfully. The meat was tough, the bread coarse, but it was honest food, the fare of a house that had endured despite hardship. "This will not shock me," she said softly. Sebastian looked up. "What will not?" "That Ravensleigh is diminished, that our meal is plain. Beauty does not always wear finery, my lord. Sometimes it waits in corners, quiet and steadfast." His gaze lingered on her face, as though measuring the truth of her words. In the flicker of candlelight, he noted again the grace in her profile, the luminous steadiness of her eyes. Plain muslin could not disguise it. For an instant, he almost spoke, but thought better, and drank instead. After supper, she was shown to her chambers. A room vast but chill, the bed hung with faded damask, the hearth unlit. A maid stammered apologies about the lack of coal. Charlotte dismissed her gently and crossed to the window. Outside, the grounds lay vast and shadowed, the silhouettes of falcon statues rising from balustrades. She pressed her hand to the glass. This was her new life. Not as governess, but as mistress of a house that tested her resolve from the very first night. And yet, in the flickering dark, she felt not despair, but determination. Charlotte stood within Ravensleigh's faded halls. Beauty and courage her only dowry, and in their quiet strength, the house itself seemed to draw a first, unsteady breath. Chapter 4. A Wife in Name. The bells of Ravensleigh tolled the hour of 6. The sound hollow as it echoed through corridors long starved of joy. Charlotte stood at the dressing table in her new chambers, a fire crackling at last in the hearth. A maid fussed with pins, smoothing the fall of her dark hair, while Charlotte sat still, heart restless. This night would be her first true appearance as mistress of the house. She had been a governess only yesterday. Tonight she would take her place across from Sebastian at the long table, not as servant, but as countess. Her gown was pale blue muslin, altered swiftly by Harbury's seamstress before her departure. Its modest bodice bore embroidered lace, its sleeves gathered before narrowing at the wrist, where ivory kid gloves fitted snug. No diamonds sparkled at her neck, only the pearl comb set in her hair and the plain gold ring on her finger. Yet as she rose and smoothed her skirts, Charlotte caught her reflection and thought, I do not look like a governess any longer. The maid stepped back and curtsied. You are very handsome, my lady. Charlotte smiled faintly, uncertain whether she believed it, but grateful all the same. The dining hall felt cavernous when she entered. A single candelabrum lit its centre, shadows leaping along carved oak panels. Sebastian stood at the far end, waiting. He wore a coat of black broadcloth and a waistcoat of sober silver grey, his cravat arranged with the careless precision of a gentleman well acquainted with fashion, yet entirely indifferent to it. His dark hair, though combed, refused complete obedience. He bowed. My lady, my lord. She took her seat, absurdly far across the long table. At Sebastian's nod, the butler signalled, and dinner began. The first course was a soup of barley and leek, steaming gently in porcelain bowls that bore hairline cracks. Next came roast capon with sage, accompanied by potatoes and winter greens. For dessert, a custard tart, golden and trembling. Silver mismatched, porcelain worn, but the food Charlotte found was nourishing. She lifted her spoon. It is good, she said softly, directing her praise to the servants as much as to her husband. The cook peeked from the doorway, cheeks flushed with pride. Sebastian ate in silence, movements measured. Charlotte ventured again. The capon is excellent. He looked up at last. You are kind to say so. Many would find such fare beneath notice. Many are foolish, Charlotte replied. Honest food is never beneath notice. For the first time, a faint quirk touched his mouth. Not quite a smile, but close. The silence lengthened, filled by the muted clink of knives and forks. Charlotte studied him across the table. The flickering candlelight etched shadows into his face, accentuating the sharpness of his jaw, the hollows beneath his eyes. She thought of the whispers she had overheard at Thornleigh. Debts, squandered fortune, mismanagement. Now, seated across from him, she wanted to understand. My lord, she said gently, how did it come to this? His fork stilled. Come to what? To Ravensleigh's decline. To your need of me. A muscle worked in his jaw. For a moment she thought he would refuse, but something in her gaze, steady, compassionate, compelled him. He leaned back, his expression grave. My father left debts. More than he admitted, more than I discovered until it was too late. He loved cards, horses, and the illusion of wealth. When I inherited, I found the accounts already bleeding. Charlotte listened, silent. I might have salvaged it, he went on, but I was young, too proud to ask counsel. Then came the war. My younger brother fell in Portugal, and I bore the cost of his commission, his funeral, his widow's pension. I sold lands piecemeal to cover debts, but each sale shrank the estate further. By the time I returned, Ravensleigh was a husk of itself. And the town, he gave a short laugh, without mirth. The town is quick to scent blood. They call me proud, but what they mean is ruined. Charlotte's throat tightened. She had known hardship in humbler ways, but to watch a great inheritance crumble must have been its own torment. You carry it heavily, she murmured. I carry it alone. His gaze fixed on her. Until now. Her heart quickened. He had offered neither affection nor welcome, yet neither had he denied her place beside him. I will not shrink from it, she said. He inclined his head. So I chose you. The words were blunt, but beneath them she heard something unspoken. Respect, perhaps even admiration. When the custard tart was cleared away, Charlotte rose first. As mistress of the house, she thanked the servants warmly, her voice carrying down the line. They blinked, surprised, as though courtesy had been a stranger here. A few even smiled. Later, in her chamber, Charlotte removed her pearl comb and set it upon the table beside her ring. She undressed slowly, folding her gown with care, and lay down in the vast bed. She was his wife. She was Countess of Ravensleigh. She carried his debts now, his burdens, his name, but not yet his heart. By candle's end, Charlotte knew she was mistress of a house, and partner to a man whose fortunes lay in ruin, bound to him in name, yet longing for a place deeper than duty. Chapter 5. Whispers in the Village. Morning at Ravensleigh broke with pale light straining through tall windows, casting long bars of gold across the dusty floors. Charlotte rose from her bed in the east chamber, where she had slept alone. The vast canopy above her, hung with faded damask, seemed almost too large for a single occupant, but she was grateful for solitude. The arrangement had been made clear from the beginning. Sebastian occupied his own rooms in the western wing, and she hers. They were husband and wife, yet strangers still, bound by contract, not by closeness. Her maid fastened her into a gown of warm chestnut wool, trimmed at the hem with narrow black braids. Over it she drew a pelisse of dove-grey velvet, soft at the throat where a clasp shaped like a falcon held it closed. A bonnet with pale ribbon framed her dark hair, simple yet elegant. Descending the staircase, she found Sebastian waiting. He looked severe in a coat of dark green broadcloth, buff breeches and polished boots, his cravat tied without ornament. He inclined his head politely, the gesture of a man to his companion, not his wife. "You rise early," Charlotte said, adjusting her gloves. "I have business in the village." His tone was clipped, but after a pause, he added, "It will not harm you to be seen." She knew what he meant. Their marriage had been sudden, quiet, almost secret. The village would gossip. Today she would be measured, weighed, whispered about. The carriage jolted down the lane, past hedgerows and bare fields, into the heart of Ravensleigh village. Smoke curled from chimneys. Children chased hens through yards. Men leaned on cartwheels to stare. Faces turned. Whispers stirred. Charlotte sat straight, her hands folded in her lap, refusing to flinch. At the square the stalls brimmed with apples, cheese and bolts of wool. The inn stood at one end, its painted sign worn by weather. Across from it, the baker's shop breathed out the warm scent of bread. Sebastian stepped down first and offered his hand. She placed hers in his, light as a feather, and for an instant his grip tightened, steadying her. As her skirts brushed the cobbles, a hush fell. "This is Lady Ravensleigh. You will show her courtesy." Some curtsied, others only stared. Charlotte inclined her head with serene composure, though she heard the whispers carried on the chill air. A governess, not one of us. Why her? Inside the baker's shop, warmth enfolded them. Loaves lined the shelves. Golden crusted, buns dusted with sugar gleamed, tarts shone with ruby jam. Charlotte breathed deeply, comforted by the simple abundance. Sebastian ordered bread and honey cakes, coins ringing against the counter. Charlotte caught the gaze of a shy girl, peering from behind a curtain. "Do you help your father here?" she asked gently. "Yes, my lady. These are the finest cakes I have ever seen." The girl flushed crimson, darting away with a laugh. The baker glowed with pride. When Charlotte and Sebastian stepped back onto the street, villagers' eyes followed. Softer now, their suspicion eased by her kindness. At the inn, Sebastian ordered mulled cider for himself and tea for her. They sat by the fire, where warmth and spice filled the air. A trencher was brought with fresh bread, golden butter, and slices of cold beef. Charlotte savoured the bread, thinking it homely but satisfying. "The village is wary of me," she murmured. "They know little of you," Sebastian said, "and much of gossip." She met his eyes. "Then let them learn." He studied her in silence, then gave a single nod. "You are not what they expected." "And you, my lord?" Her lips curved faintly. "Did you expect me?" The corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile. "No." When they returned to Ravensleigh at dusk, Charlotte carried with her a small parcel of honeycakes. She offered them to the kitchen staff, her voice warm. For us all, we must share in sweetness when we can. The youngest maid's eyes shone with delight, and even the housekeeper's stern face softened a degree. Later, Charlotte climbed to her own chamber. She unfastened her bonnet, set aside her pelisse, and looked at the lonely sweep of the bed. Across the house, somewhere in the western wing, Sebastian would be settling in his own room, as separate as if leagues lay between them. They were husband and wife in name, partners before the village, but strangers still when night fell. That evening, as Charlotte lay in her solitary bed and Sebastian in his, both knew that though the village had seen them united, their marriage remained a pact of necessity, not yet of heart. Chapter 6. Secrets of the East Wing. Morning brought a grey sky and a fine drizzle that blurred the edges of the moors. Charlotte sat in the breakfast parlour, its windows clouded with damp, while a maid set before her a modest spread. Porridge with cream, brown bread still warm from the oven, a dish of stewed prunes, and a small wedge of cheese. The fire struggled to banish the chill, but she drew her shawl tighter and made herself eat. Sebastian did not join her. He had already ridden out, the butler reported, to inspect tenant lands. Charlotte nodded, though disappointment stirred. They had shared dinners in silence, but even silence was something. The empty chair across from her seemed to mock the promise of marriage. She spooned porridge slowly, thinking of the day ahead. Ravensleigh was vast, its corridors still unfamiliar. The house beckoned her, even in its faded state, with a mixture of majesty and sorrow. She longed to understand it, and him. Her steps took her first through the great hall, its portraits watching with disapproval. Dust filmed the frames, cobwebs hung in corners, where servants had ceased to venture. Charlotte's slippers tapped against stone as she climbed the sweeping staircase, her gloved hand brushing the worn banister. The west wing she knew already, her chambers, the dining hall, Sebastian's study where he barred the door to her with polite firmness. But the east wing lay silent, its corridor dim, lined with shuttered windows. A draught curled along the floorboards, lifting the hem of her gown. She wore a walking dress of soft grey merino, its bodice high-necked, with long sleeves that shielded her from the chill. Her hair, plaited simply, was bound with a ribbon the colour of violets. The plainness of her attire suited the exploration, though the pearl comb at her temple glimmered as if insisting she remembered her new station. At first, the rooms she peered into were unremarkable. A faded drawing room with moth-eaten upholstery, a chamber where dust sheets draped furniture like the ghosts of gatherings long past. The air smelled of neglect, tinged with damp. But at the far end of the passage, she found a door unlike the rest. Heavy oak, its handle tarnished, its keyhole dark. When she pressed, it did not yield. Locked. Charlotte's breath quickened. She tried again, rattling the handle, to no avail. Someone had barred this room deliberately. That evening, over dinner, a joint of boiled beef with mustard, carrots and a pudding of suet and raisins. She studied Sebastian across the table. He ate sparingly, his expression guarded. "I walked the east wing today," she said casually, as though remarking on the weather. His knife stilled. "Did you? It is very quiet there." "Dusty." He looked up sharply. "You had no reason to be in that wing. I thought, as mistress of Ravensleigh, every room must concern me. Every room but one." Charlotte's heart gave a small leap. "Then you admit there is one?" He set down his fork with deliberate care. "There is a chamber in the east wing that is not to be entered. You will respect that." Her curiosity flared all the hotter for the prohibition. "Why is it locked?" "Because it must remain so." His voice was final, but beneath it lay something else. Not anger, but sorrow. Charlotte held his gaze. "I am not a child to be forbidden without explanation. You are my wife. That is reason enough." The words stung, though she forced composure. "I am Lady Ravensleigh, and one day I shall know every part of this house." He pushed back his chair, the scrape loud in the silence. "Not that part. Without another word, he left the dining hall. Later, in her chamber, Charlotte sat before the fire, deep in thought. The flame wavered, shadows reaching long across the room. Her thoughts circling. A locked door. A sorrow in his eyes when he forbade it. What could he be hiding? A relic of family shame. A memory too painful to face? She touched her wedding ring, heavy on her finger. They were bound in name, but his heart was barred as tightly as that oak door. And she could not help but want the key. Alone by the fire, Charlotte understood that Ravensleigh's east wing guarded more than dust. It guarded the hidden griefs of her husband's past. Secrets he would not yet let her share. Chapter 7. A dinner among strangers. The invitation had gone out reluctantly, sealed with the Ravensleigh crest that still carried weight though its fortunes had waned. Charlotte had seen the names: Sir Thomas and Lady Ashcombe of Fernleigh, Mr. and Mrs. Radley from Lower Riston, and the vicar and his wife. They were neighbours of influence, the sort whose opinions could shape the tide of gossip in a county. When the evening came, Charlotte stood in her chamber before the long mirror. Her maid fastened her into a gown of muted slate blue wool, one of the few better dresses Lady Harbury had pressed upon her before her departure. The bodice fitted snug, trimmed with cream lace at the neckline, the sleeves puffed just enough to balance the skirt's fall. Around her waist a narrow sash of ivory satin drew in her figure. At her ears hung pearl drops, modest yet luminous, and in her dark hair the pearl comb shone like a quiet star. "You look beautiful, my lady," the maid whispered, stepping back. Charlotte drew a steadying breath. "Then, let us hope beauty is enough." In the great hall below, Sebastian awaited in a coat of black velvet, his waistcoat of burgundy silk, his cravat tied with precise severity. He looked formidable, though a faint crease between his brows betrayed unease. "You are ready," he said as Charlotte descended the staircase. "As I shall ever be," she replied, her hand light upon the banister. He offered his arm, formal, distant, and together they entered the dining hall, where the long table gleamed with its best effort. Candles blazed in silver sticks. Polished though dented, damask cloth concealed much of the wood's scarring. Crystal goblets, brought down from high cupboards, caught the light bravely. The supper had been planned with care. A soup of white onion and cream, a roast of venison with juniper, potatoes browned in dripping, buttered carrots, and for the sweet course, an apple charlotte with custard. The cook had stretched stores and pride alike to achieve it. The guests arrived in a flurry of carriages. Lady Ashcombe swept in first, a figure draped in lavender silk, heavy with embroidery, her hair piled high with diamonds. Sir Thomas followed, bluff and hearty, smelling faintly of brandy. Mr. and Mrs. Radley arrived next, she in pale green muslin with emeralds glittering at her throat, he in sober black with the air of a man who preferred accounts to conversation. Last came the vicar and his wife, the latter plump and pink-cheeked, her gown sprigged with roses, her eyes sharp despite her genial smile. Charlotte greeted each with composure, though she felt the weight of their scrutiny. The governess, their eyes seemed to whisper. The upstart. How odd. How sudden. At table, conversation began with the weather and the harvest, as though nothing unusual sat at the head of the board, yet beneath the civility ran currents sharp as knives. "I had not expected Ravensleigh to host again so soon," Lady Ashcombe said sweetly, sipping soup. "How fortunate for us, to see its halls lit." Sebastian's jaw tightened. Ravensleigh has always welcomed its neighbours. Charlotte smiled, determined to soften the edge. "It is a pleasure to meet you all. I confess the manner is still new to me, but I find it compelling." Mrs. Radley tilted her head. "And how sudden your good fortune, Lady Ravensleigh. It must have been quite a surprise to all." Charlotte held her spoon steadily. Surprises are sometimes the best of life's gifts. One must only be brave enough to accept them. The vicar's wife chuckled, though her eyes were sharp. "Indeed, and were you not employed with Lady Harbury's daughters, until so recently?" There it was. The test. Charlotte inclined her head. "I was. They were dear girls, and I remain fond of them, I hope they will always think well of me. Sebastian's hand tightened on his glass. My wife is more than a governess. She is mistress of Ravensleigh. His voice carried like iron struck on stone. The table hushed a beat before conversation resumed, more cautious now. The venison was served, fragrant with juniper. Charlotte took her portion gracefully, speaking with the vicar about parish schools, then turning to Lady Ashcombe to ask after Fernleigh's gardens. She smiled, she listened, she offered praise where it was due. Slowly, the frost thawed. Curiosity remained, but suspicion lessened. For dessert, the apple charlotte arrived, golden, fragrant, its crust sugared, custard poured steaming at its side. Charlotte could not help but smile at the irony of the dish bearing her name. "It is my first evening presiding at Ravensleigh's table," she said lightly. "May this pudding be as sweet as the welcome we hope to share." Laughter rippled, genuine at last. Even Lady Ashcombe's smile seemed less barbed. Later, when the guests departed, their carriages clattering into the night, Charlotte stood in the hall with Sebastian beside her. The candles guttered. The house sighed with relief. "You bore it well," Sebastian said at last, his voice low. "They are not monsters," Charlotte replied. "Only curious." "They are judges," he corrected. "And you won a measure of reprieve." His gaze lingered, and in it she thought she saw more than approval, a flicker of admiration, when he turned toward the west wing, and she toward the east. The space between them echoed with all that had not yet been spoken. Chapter 8. Shadows of the Past. A storm rolled in overnight, its rain lashing against Ravensleigh's mullioned windows until dawn. Charlotte woke to the patter of drops, the hearth cold despite embers left banked. She wrapped herself in a shawl and rang for her maid, who brought a breakfast tray. A soft-boiled egg, buttered toast, and a dish of gooseberry jam. The food was plain, but the gesture touched her. The staff, hesitant at first, were beginning to accept her. Charlotte ate slowly, listening to the storm. Each gust rattled the panes, reminding her of the manor's age, its quiet secrets. Her thoughts returned to the locked chamber in the east wing. Why was it forbidden? Why had sorrow shadowed Sebastian's eyes when she mentioned it? She dressed in a gown of dark plum wool, sober but flattering, its skirt trimmed with narrow black ribbon. Her hair was coiled neatly, pinned with the pearl comb that had become her talisman. She felt armoured, though uncertainty pricked her. The day passed in uneasy silence. Sebastian remained in his study, the door barred. Charlotte walked the galleries, attended briefly to household accounts, and sought distraction in conversation with the housekeeper, Mrs. Hodge, who proved practical but reserved. In the course of these efforts at diversion, she found herself once more before the east wing. Rain drummed upon the roof above, the corridor chill with draughts. The locked door stood at its end, its oak panels dark with age. She placed her hand upon the handle, knowing it would not yield, but touched it all the same. As her fingers brushed the cold metal, a voice echoed behind her. "You should not be here." Charlotte started, spinning to find Sebastian standing in the shadows. His coat was damp with rain, his hair tousled, his eyes hard. "I was walking," she said steadily. "You were trespassing. I am mistress of this house. How can I trespass within my own home? That room is not yours." "Then whose is it?" He did not answer at once. Instead, his gaze flicked to the door with an expression she had not seen before. Raw grief, quickly shuttered. Charlotte's voice softened. "Sebastian, what is it you hide from me?" He drew a sharp breath, then shook his head. "Do not ask." And with that he turned, his boots striking the floor with angry finality, leaving her alone in the corridor, the storm's fury beyond the windows echoing the turmoil within. That evening, the housekeeper served supper in the smaller dining parlour. Pigeon pie with onions, mashed parsnips, and a baked custard for dessert. Charlotte ate alone, Sebastian having pled work. She cut the pie's crust, but her appetite faltered. The candlelight cast shadows that seemed to deepen Ravensleigh's gloom. Her thoughts circled. Sebastian's sorrow, the locked chamber, the silence that bound them. She longed to pierce it, not for curiosity's sake alone, but because she could not bear the gulf between them. Later, in her chamber, she stood before the fire in her night rail, brushing out her dark hair. Each stroke of the comb seemed to steady her resolve. She had chosen this life, this man, this house, and she would not be content with half-truths. One day, she vowed silently, she would open that door. Alone by her fire, Charlotte sensed the unrest within Ravensleigh mirroring the storm that battered the night outside, and knew that until Sebastian shared his shadows, she could never fully share his life. Chapter 9. The First Fracture. The next morning dawned bright after the storm, sunlight spilling across the lawns in deceptive cheer. Charlotte dressed with care, though her options were few. From the modest trunk she had brought from Lady Harbury's household, she chose a gown of grey wool, brushed until the nap was smooth. Its hem showed faint wear at the edges, but she had tacked a narrow band of dark blue ribbon to disguise the fray. Over her shoulders, she drew a serviceable spencer of brown kerseymere, plain but warm. Her gloves had been cleaned and mended, though the seams bore witness to years of careful use. She paused before the mirror. Countess of Ravensleigh, and yet her reflection was little different from that of the governess she had been. Beauty she had, a grace no worn fabric could dim, but garments told their own story, and hers spoke of modest means. When she entered the breakfast parlour, Sebastian was already seated. He wore a coat of dark brown superfine, his cravat tied with brisk efficiency, his boots polished though still bearing a trace of yesterday's mud. A tray had been set between them. Rashers of bacon, poached eggs, bread toasted and buttered, marmalade, and a pot of steaming coffee. Sebastian glanced at her attire, his brow tightening ever so slightly. "You will require new gowns." Charlotte's cheeks warmed. "These have served me well enough. They are not the garments of a countess. The village seamstress will not suffice. I will send to Bath, perhaps London." Her instinct was to bristle, but she held her tongue. Pride whispered that she had managed all her life with little, yet a deeper voice acknowledged the truth. She was mistress now, and Ravensleigh's dignity rested upon her shoulders, as surely as upon his. Still, she lifted her chin. "Clothes alone will not make me Lady Ravensleigh." His gaze flicked to hers. "Unreadable. No, but they will prevent others from forgetting it." They ate in silence after that, but the matter lingered between them, unspoken yet heavy. At last, Charlotte laid down her knife. "Sebastian," she said softly, "there is another matter we must speak of." His eyes narrowed, wary. "Of what?" "The East Wing." The air seemed to shift, taut with unspoken words. His fork stilled, then clattered faintly against porcelain. "We have spoken enough of that." "No," she answered, her voice steady despite the quickening of her pulse. "You forbid me without reason. You shut me out of your house, of your life. How are we to be husband and wife if you keep doors barred?" "Not every truth need be shared. Marriage demands it. Marriage demands duty and respect. And secrecy, apparently," she said sadly. "Enough, Charlotte." The words rang in the small room, sharp and final. For a moment she could not breathe. But then, her voice low, she answered, "I will not be cowed by silence or anger. You chose me because I would not falter. Do not expect me to start now." Sebastian's breath came harsh, as though reined in by force. He rose, sunlight catching his face, stark, beautiful, and wounded. "You know nothing of what you ask. And until you do, keep away from that door." He strode from the room, boots echoing against stone, leaving behind the rich scent of coffee and the sting of words too sharp to recall. The rest of the day passed in uneasy quiet. Charlotte walked the gardens alone, gravel crunching beneath her slippers, the winter roses pale against frost. She thought of his anger, of the grief she had glimpsed behind it. Her heart ached with frustration, yet also with the strange knowledge that this was the first true clash between them, the first time silence had given way to something raw. That evening, dinner was set with mutton stew and turnips, served in earthenware bowls, accompanied by bread still warm from the oven. They ate with only the crackle of fire between them. Charlotte lifted her spoon, but her appetite was gone. The tension felt less like absence now, and more like a rope pulled taut. At last she rose, excusing herself. But as she reached the doorway, Sebastian's voice stopped her. "Charlotte." She turned, her hand still upon the panel. "You are right to demand more, but I am not ready to give it." Their eyes met. His face was shuttered, yet in the lines of it she read a confession unspoken. He could not share, not yet, but perhaps one day. She inclined her head and left him to the shadows. As Charlotte lay awake in her modest night-rail, beneath the faded damask of her solitary bed, she knew their silence had fractured at last, and though it broke in anger, even the rift might prove a step toward truth. Chapter 10. A Glimmer of Trust. The next morning Charlotte found herself summoned to the small withdrawing room, where Mrs. Hodge, the housekeeper, awaited with a stern-faced seamstress from the village. A tape measure hung around the woman's neck, and her basket brimmed with chalk, pins and folded muslin. "My lady," Mrs. Hodge began, with the stiff politeness she always used, "His lordship has ordered a set of gowns be prepared for you, until the parcels arrive from Bath or London. Mistress Keyes will see to what may be done here." Charlotte's throat tightened. She looked down at her gown of brown wool, neatly pressed but undeniably plain, the fabric polished thin at the elbows. "That is hardly necessary." But the seamstress was already circling her, calling out measurements. "Waist 22, bust 32, shoulders narrow but straight enough. She'll wear the new muslin well." Pins pricked her skin, chalk traced pale lines along the fabric. Charlotte stood motionless, her hands clasped, her cheeks warming. She had attended fittings before, for the Harbury girls, never for herself. To be measured like a lady was strange, unsettling, and yet it stirred something deep. Mistress Keyes held up a length of pale muslin sprigged with violets. For day wear. Serviceable, but with grace. From her basket she drew a bolt of rose-coloured silk, with a faint sheen, for evenings. This will suit her dark hair. Charlotte caught her breath. She could not imagine herself in silk. Not yet. But she nodded, fingers brushing the fabric as though it might vanish. Later, when Sebastian returned from his ride, Charlotte found him in the hall. He removed his gloves, his coat damp with dew. "You sent for gowns," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I did," he answered, his gaze flicked to her plain dress. "You are Countess now. Ravensleigh must be respected. For that you must be seen as you are." "As I am?" His eyes softened a fraction. "As you deserve to be." The words lodged in her heart, unexpected, almost tender. She inclined her head, unable to trust her voice. That afternoon, a commotion broke the household's routine. In the kitchen, smoke billowed. The great iron oven had cracked along one seam, spilling ash. The cook wrung her hands, despairing that supper for the household could not be prepared. Charlotte hurried in, skirts gathered. Sebastian arrived moments later, summoned by the scent of smoke. "Stand back." He strode to the oven, but Charlotte stepped forward beside him, her hand on the cook's trembling arm. "We can make do. There are joints enough to roast upon the spit, and the stews may be set upon the smaller hearth. Bread can be baked in the iron pans. It will not be elegant, but it will be sufficient." Sebastian glanced at her, surprise flickering. "You know kitchens well." She smiled faintly. A governess learns every corner of a household, even those where she is not expected. Children must be fed whether ovens crack or not. For the first time his mouth curved, not mockery, not bitterness, but the shadow of a smile. "Then Ravensleigh is fortunate." Together, they directed the flustered servants. Sebastian hauled a heavy pot to the smaller hearth. Charlotte rolled up her sleeves to knead dough for flatbread. The servants watched in astonishment as lord and lady worked side by side. By evening, a meal was served. Roast beef turned upon the spit, onions stewed with butter, flatbread warm from the pan, and a small glass of lemon posset. It was not grand, but it was hearty, and it fed them all. At table, Sebastian raised his glass in acknowledgement. To improvisation. She lifted hers in answer. To partnership. That night in her chamber, Charlotte set aside the day's gown, folded carefully though worn. She touched the swatch of silk the seamstress had left behind, and let herself imagine. The rustle of fabric finer than she had ever worn. The feeling of stepping into a life remade. It was daunting. Yes. But for the first time since she had entered Ravensleigh, she felt a thread of trust binding her to the man who had chosen her, and to the house that waited for her hand. As Charlotte laid the swatch of rose silk upon her table, she knew the fabric was more than cloth. It was a promise of change, a glimmer of trust that even Sebastian could not yet name. Chapter 11. The Village Fair. The morning dawned crisp, the air sharp with the promise of frost, yet the village square hummed with life. It was fair day, the one time of year when every tenant, cottager and farmer gathered to trade, feast and make merry. For Charlotte, it would be her first appearance of consequence since the whispers of her marriage had begun. She dressed with trembling hands, for today she would wear one of the gowns commissioned for her new station. Mistress Keyes, the seamstress, had laboured late by candlelight, and at last the first piece was ready. A gown of soft dove-coloured silk, the bodice gently ruched, the sleeves long and fitted, the skirt falling in graceful folds. At her waist a sash of violet satin drew the eye to her slender form. A cloak of dark wool lined with silk was fastened at her throat with a silver clasp in the shape of a falcon, a discreet gift from Sebastian. Her maid stepped back with wide eyes. "My lady, you look as though you were born to it." "Let us hope the village agrees," Charlotte said quietly. Sebastian waited below, dressed with a different kind of elegance, a coat of deep blue superfine buff breeches and polished boots. His cravat was tied neatly, his dark hair combed back with an effort that could not quite tame it. He looked formidable, his severity certain to stand in contrast to the fair's festive spirit. "You are ready." "As I shall ever be." The carriage conveyed them down the lane, its wheels crunching over gravel and frost. As they entered the village, Charlotte heard the hum of voices, the bray of animals, the creak of carts. The square was a riot of colour. Stalls hung with bright ribbons, tables laden with pies, cheeses and sugared almonds. Children darted between sheep pens, fiddlers played lively tunes by the inn's door, the scent of roasting chestnuts drifted in the air. Heads turned as the Ravensleigh carriage halted. Silence rippled through the crowd, whispers threading. Sebastian descended first, then offered his hand. Charlotte placed hers in his, stepping down with measured grace. Gasps rose at the sight of her new gown, the sheen of silk marking her as more than governess now. "Lady Ravensleigh." His voice carried over the square. Some bowed, some curtsied, a few only stared. Charlotte inclined her head, her smile calm, though she felt every gaze upon her like a weight. The fair unfolded around them. At the baker's stall, loaves stood in proud rows, their crusts golden. Charlotte purchased a small honey cake and pressed it into a child's hands with a kind word. The child's smile was bright as the sun. At the cheesemonger's, wheels of cheddar and rounds of soft curd were stacked high. She praised their richness, and the farmer's wife, suspicious at first, warmed beneath the compliment. At the ribbon stall, bolts of satin and lace fluttered in the breeze. Charlotte chose a length of pale blue for the youngest maid at Ravensleigh, picturing the girl's delight. Every household must carry its share of cheer. Not all glances were friendly. She caught whispers. A governess in silk. The Earl must be desperate, yet she held her head high, her composure unbroken. At midday they were invited to the inn, where a meal had been laid in honour of the fair. The long table bore platters of roast goose with apple stuffing, pigeon pies, bowls of pickled cucumbers, rounds of crusty bread, and puddings heavy with suet and currants. Ale and cider flowed freely. Charlotte ate sparingly, but with genuine praise. "The goose is excellent," she told their host, and the man's face lit with pride. Conversation was lively, though barbed beneath its cheer. Lady Ashcombe leaned forward, her diamonds flashing even in the dim light. "My dear Lady Ravensleigh, I cannot help but admire your gown. So very simple, and yet quite improved. One would never suspect it to be new." Charlotte met her gaze steadily. "Mistress Keyes has a gift. Ravensleigh is fortunate in her skill." A flicker of irritation crossed Lady Ashcombe's face. Her attempt at condescension deflected with grace. Sebastian's lips curved, the barest ghost of approval. As dusk fell, torches were lit, and the fiddlers struck up again. Charlotte walked once more through the square, her cloak wrapped against the chill. Villagers smiled now, tentative but warmer than before. She had eaten their food, praised their wares, shared their laughter. When they returned to the carriage, Sebastian offered his hand once more. "You bore it well. They are not unkind, only uncertain. They will always be uncertain, but tonight you lessened it." Their eyes met in the dim torchlight. For the first time Charlotte felt the distance between them narrow, not closed but bridged for a moment. Chapter 12. Echoes in the Night. The manor lay hushed beneath the moon. Charlotte lay in her bed, her chamber dark, but for the faint glow of embers in the hearth. She had dismissed her maid hours earlier, and the silence pressed close. Outside, owls called across the grounds, their wings whispering in the frosty air. Her night rail was of fine lawn, plain but softened with age, the sleeves loose about her wrists. She drew the coverlet higher, though the damask hangings around the bed did little to keep out the draught. A tray rested on a table nearby, a glass of warm milk, a small currant bun dusted with sugar, left by a thoughtful maid who had begun to treat her with gentle loyalty. Charlotte had eaten half the bun, the sweetness lingering even now. Yet despite the comfort, sleep would not come. Her mind turned, restless, circling the locked chamber in the east wing. Sebastian's sorrow and the careful distance he maintained. Then, in the stillness, she heard it. A sound, faint, muffled, drifting down the corridor beyond her door. A creak. A soft scrape, as though someone moved where no one should. Charlotte sat up, her heart quickening. She slipped from bed, drawing her shawl about her shoulders, and lit a candle. Its flame flickered, throwing long shadows across the chamber walls. Barefoot, she opened her door. The corridor stretched dim and draughty, moonlight seeping through high windows. She listened, straining. There it was again, a thud, a murmur of something heavy shifting. The direction was clear. The east wing. She walked slowly, her bare feet whispering against the cold stone. The air grew colder as she neared the forbidden passage, her candle guttering. Shadows clung to the carved panels, and the silence between sounds seemed deeper than silence should be. At the end of the passage she paused. The locked door loomed, heavy and immovable, its iron handle dull. She raised her candle, breath catching. Nothing, only the hush of the house. And then, faint, unmistakable, the sound of weeping. Charlotte's heart twisted. A woman's sob, soft and broken, echoing as though from behind the door. She reached out, her hand trembling, and pressed her palm against the wood. "Who is there?" No answer, only silence, and the guttering of her candle. The sobbing ceased as though it had never been. She stood frozen, every sense straining, before retreating step by step, her breath shallow. Back in her chamber, she set down the candle with unsteady hands. She listened, but the night was still again. When morning came, she told herself it had been a dream, her imagination conjuring ghosts from whispers. Yet the chill in her bones argued otherwise. At breakfast, Sebastian was present for once. He wore a coat of black broadcloth, his cravat tied with careless haste. His expression was weary, shadows beneath his eyes suggesting little sleep. Charlotte, dressed in her new morning gown of pale muslin trimmed with lilac ribbon, studied him. "You were not in your rooms last night?" His gaze flicked up, sharp. "Why do you ask?" "I heard." She stopped. To speak of sobbing seemed impossible. "I thought I heard someone." The silence stretched. He set down his cup. "There is no one in the East Wing. Do not let your imagination wander there." Her hands tightened around her spoon. "Yet something wanders there, and I think it is not only my imagination." His jaw hardened. "Charlotte, leave it." Her heart ached, but she inclined her head, unwilling to quarrel before the servants. Yet inside she thought, "Leave it, I cannot." That evening, in her chamber, Charlotte touched the pearl comb in her hair and gazed at her reflection. She looked every inch the Countess now, clothed in muslin, silk, and dignity, yet beneath it she was still the woman who had heard sorrow in the night, and who longed to share the burden of a man too proud to let her in. As the house settled into darkness once more, Charlotte knew she could not rest until she uncovered the truth of Ravensleigh's shadows and the secret Sebastian kept locked away from her heart. Chapter 13. The Breaking Point. The days that followed brought no peace. Charlotte moved through Ravensleigh's corridors with composure, but inside she carried restlessness like a hidden flame. At night, when the house was still, she strained to hear again the echoes she had once heard. The sobbing behind the locked door, yet silence reigned, and silence was worse. On the third morning she rose determined. She dressed in a gown of dark green merino wool, the bodice plain but edged with black ribbon. A fichu of white lace softened the severity, though her mood needed no gentling. Her hair was drawn back firmly, the pearl comb catching the pale winter light. At breakfast, Sebastian awaited her. He wore a coat of black superfine, his waistcoat grey, his cravat tied with careless economy. He looked as though sleep had eluded him, shadows beneath his eyes, his expression set. The meal was simple, kedgeree of rice and smoked fish, toast and a dish of quince marmalade. Charlotte lifted her spoon, then set it down untouched. "My lord, I cannot remain in ignorance any longer." His gaze sharpened. "Of what? Of what lies behind the locked door? Of what haunts these halls? Of what haunts you?" His knife paused mid-cut. For a moment, only the tick of the clock filled the room. Then, deliberately, he resumed eating. "I told you before, it is not your concern." Her hands clenched in her lap. "I am your wife. In name." The words struck like a blow. She drew breath, steadying herself. "If you keep me only in name, you condemn us both to misery. I cannot be half a wife, Sebastian. I will not." His fork clattered onto his plate. "And if I tell you, Charlotte, if I bear to you what I have locked away, will you bear it? Or will you shrink from it as others have done?" She rose, her chair scraping back. "Try me." The air between them bristled, charged with anger, sorrow, and something perilously close to yearning. That evening, dinner was no gentler. The cook had attempted something finer in honor of the day's hunt, hare stewed in red wine with onions, accompanied by potatoes roasted crisp, and a dish of buttered peas. For dessert, a syllabub had been whipped to froth, served in glass cups. But the elegance of the meal only underscored the tension. Charlotte tasted little. Sebastian drank more heavily than usual, the claret vanishing from his glass. "You are relentless." "Because I must be." "You pry into wounds you cannot heal." "Because you will not let me try." Their eyes locked across the table. His hand tightened around his glass until she feared it might shatter. Then he set it down with care, as though every movement cost him. "You are different. You look at me as though I am still a man to be trusted. Do not. I cannot bear it." Charlotte's heart twisted. She rose slowly, her gown whispering around her ankles. "I will not stop, because I cannot bear a life where we share walls, a name, a table, and nothing else. For a heartbeat she thought he might break, might speak. His face softened, shadows chasing shadows. But then he turned, pushing back his chair. "Then you will be disappointed." He strode from the hall, leaving the syllabub untouched, the candles burning low. Charlotte remained, hands braced on the table, her breath unsteady. Anger surged in her chest, but beneath it lay something stranger. Hope. For at last he had spoken not with silence, but with fire. For the first time she felt she had reached him, if only by forcing him to turn away. As Charlotte returned alone to her chamber, she knew the breaking point had come, and though it left her heart bruised, it was also the first crack through which truth might yet enter. Chapter 14. Confession by Candlelight. Ravensleigh was changing, and Charlotte had been the hand that wrought it. It began with the simplest of things. Fires were lit earlier in the day, not only in the great hall but in the servants' quarters, where frost had long nipped fingers and toes. Windows were scrubbed until light pierced through grime. Rugs once left to fray were beaten and mended. A new schedule was set, the scullery maid relieved of endless drudgery by fairer rotation, the footman given tasks suited to his strength, not punishment for past idleness. Charlotte moved among them with quiet authority, her voice firm but never cruel. She praised where praise was due, corrected with kindness, and rewarded with small tokens. A honey cake brought from the baker, a length of ribbon from the fair. The servants, once wary, began to stand straighter, their eyes warming when she entered a room. Even Mrs. Hodge, the housekeeper with lips tight as a purse string, conceded grudgingly that the house breathes better under her hand. And so Ravensleigh breathed again, yet one part of it remained shut. The east wing loomed always in Charlotte's thoughts, and more so now that the rest of the house stirred with life. She could no longer bear the dissonance. Light and warmth spreading outward, while one corridor lay locked, dark, and haunted. One evening after supper, roast venison dressed with red currant jelly, and a trifle layered with custard and jelly for sweet. Charlotte found Sebastian in his study. The fire burned low, casting his face in planes of light and shadow. He sat with a decanter before him, untouched, his hands steepled as though bracing against himself. She entered quietly. "Sebastian," he looked up, weary. "You should be at rest." "I cannot rest while the east wing lies barred." His jaw tightened. "Charlotte." She crossed the room, standing before him, her hands clasped tightly to still their tremor. "I have not pressed you to shame you. I have pressed you because I am your wife, and because sorrow is lighter when borne by two. Let me share what burdens you." The silence stretched, long and taut. Then, with a sigh that seemed torn from him, he rose. "Very well, come. But know this. Once you see, you cannot unsee. And I do not know if you will forgive me." The corridor of the east wing was colder than the rest of the house, the air heavy with neglect. Their candlelight wavered against panelling that bore the scars of years. At the end, the locked door loomed. Sebastian withdrew a key from his coat. For a moment, he stood motionless, staring at it as though it were something far more dangerous than it appeared. Then, with a click, the lock turned. The door creaked open. Inside lay a chamber dimly lit by a single lamp. The furnishings were fine once. A carved bedstead, curtains of faded brocade, but the air was close, tinged with lavender and sorrow. And upon the bed sat a woman. She was slender, her hair once golden, now dulled, her eyes wide and unfocused. She clutched a shawl around her shoulders, though the hearth glowed faintly. At the sight of Sebastian, she stirred. "Sebastian," she whispered. "He has not come home yet, has he?" Charlotte's heart clenched. Sebastian moved slowly, kneeling before her. His voice, so often curt, softened into something raw. "No, Marianne. Henry is gone. You know this." The woman's gaze flickered, lost. She shook her head faintly. "He will come," he promised. Charlotte pressed her hand to her lips. This was no ghost. This was grief made flesh. Sebastian rose, his eyes dark with pain. "This is why the door is locked." My brother's widow, Henry's Marianne. She came to Ravensleigh when news of his death reached her. And she has never left. Her mind could not bear it. She lives between memory and shadow. And his voice broke. I could not cast her out, yet I could not show her to the world. So I kept her here, hidden, cared for, but hidden, and in hiding her, I have hidden myself. Charlotte stepped forward, her gown whispering, her candle trembling. She sat gently upon the bed's edge and took Marianne's cold hand in her own. My dear, you are not alone. Marianne blinked at her, confused, but did not pull away. Sebastian watched, his chest rising as though breath came for the first time in years. When at last they left the chamber and locked the door behind them, Sebastian leaned against the wall, his hand pressed to his brow. You should despise me, for deception, for weakness. Charlotte touched his sleeve, steady and sure. I do not despise you, I pity her. And I pity you, for carrying this alone. But now, you are not alone. His eyes searched hers, shadows and hope mingling. For a moment it seemed he might draw her into his arms. But the moment passed, and he stepped back, pride and grief still his armour. Yet Charlotte knew a wall had fallen. As Charlotte returned to her chamber, candle still in hand, she knew the locked door had opened, not only upon sorrow, but upon the first fragile thread of trust between herself and Sebastian. Chapter 15. The burden shared. Ravensleigh was changing, slowly, steadily, almost imperceptibly at first, yet undeniably. Charlotte's hand was at the centre of it. She rose each morning before the household stirred, plain in her grey muslin with lilac ribbon, her pearl comb set firmly in her hair. Accounts were balanced to the penny. The linen cupboards, once in quiet disarray, stood neatly organised. Doors that had long gone unrepaired no longer creaked in protest at every passing hour. Even the great hall, once a cavern of shadows, seemed to breathe again. Mrs. Hodge muttered under her breath, her words edged with reluctant respect. I'll grant her this. The house has not looked so well in years. Her care reached further still, to the east wing where Marianne lingered in shadows. Charlotte brought fresh linens, flowers, fires. Sometimes she carried trays herself, broth, custards, stewed apples. At first, Marianne barely stirred. Then one morning her eyes brightened at a vase of roses. She whispered softly, filled with wonder, pretty. Another day, she ate a custard in silence. Charlotte sat beside her, her voice tender and low. You are not forgotten. You are not hidden. One morning, Sebastian found Charlotte in the gallery, sleeves rolled as she directed carpets being beaten. Dust clung to her gown, her cheeks flushed with effort. He spoke from the doorway, quiet and measured. You take much upon yourself. Charlotte glanced at him, answering briskly yet warm, because much needs doing. He studied her, his tone softening. I had not thought Ravensleigh could breathe again. She paused, then replied with gentle conviction. It breathes because you kept it alive. Now it will thrive. That night, in the smaller dining parlour, supper was laid with quiet dignity. They ate mostly in silence, but it was no longer brittle. At last Sebastian spoke, his voice low and hesitant. You care for her. Charlotte lifted her gaze, steady and calm. I do, because she is yours, and now she is mine. His gaze lingered, rough with emotion. You make it sound so simple. Charlotte answered tenderly, her tone unwavering. Sometimes it is. Sometimes love is nothing more than bread, warmth, and a hand that will not let go. For the first time, she saw longing, not only sorrow in his eyes. Later in her chamber, Charlotte brushed her hair by the fire. Then came a knock. She rose quickly, breath catching, and opened the door. Sebastian stood there, candle in hand, hair tousled, eyes shadowed and searching. His voice was low, almost breaking. Charlotte, may I come in? She stepped aside. He set the candle down, then turned toward her. His words came as a confession. I have held myself apart, from duty, from fear, from the ghosts I carry. But tonight I know this. I can no longer bear the distance. I would be your husband in truth, not only in name." Charlotte's heart pounded, yet her voice did not betray her. "Nor can I. We are not strangers, Sebastian, not anymore." Something in him broke. He stepped closer, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek with trembling fingers. His whisper carried reverence. "Beautiful. I tried not to see it, but I do, every moment." She pressed his hand to her cheek, answering in a hushed voice. "Then see me, as I am, as yours." Their lips met, hesitant at first, then urgent, years of restraint burning away. His voice was raw with fear. "If you are not ready." Charlotte silenced him with a whisper. "I am, with you, only with you." The rest was tenderness and discovery. His kisses became vows, unspoken. Her hands traced the scars on his shoulders, her lips brushing them as though to heal. They learned one another not in haste, but in wonder. By dawn, the fire had died low. Charlotte lay against him, his arms secure around her. She traced his collarbone with quiet reverence, pressed a kiss to his chest, and closed her eyes. Storms would come, but she knew now they would weather them side by side. Chapter 16. The Ball at Fernleigh. The evening of the Fernleigh ball dawned crisp and clear, the frost clinging to hedgerows as if even nature held its breath. Ravensleigh was astir early, for the Countess and Earl were to make their first appearance together since the close of winter, and since something had quietly, irrevocably shifted between them. Charlotte's maid laced her into a gown of deep sapphire silk, newly arrived from Bath. The bodice fitted her closely, the skirts falling in gleaming folds, a sash of silver drawing the eye to her slender waist. Her dark hair was coiled high, pearls threaded among the braids, and the familiar comb nestled above her temple. Her cheeks glowed with a warmth that came not only from the fire, but from within. The warmth of belonging, of being cherished at last. "You look radiant, my lady," the maid whispered reverently. Charlotte touched the pearls at her throat, her heart quickening. For the first time, she did not feel like an impostor stepping into borrowed silk. She felt like herself, wife, mistress of Ravensleigh, and partner to the man who had opened both his heart and his arms to her. Sebastian awaited her in the great hall, his coat of black superfine cut to perfection, his waistcoat ivory silk, his cravat tied with soldierly exactness. Yet when he turned and saw her descending, his formality faltered. He stilled, his dark gaze softening, as though the world itself had paused. "Charlotte," her smile curved. "Do I pass inspection, my lord?" Sebastian answered without hesitation. "You silence inspection." He offered his arm, and when she placed her hand upon it, his thumb brushed against her glove with a fleeting intimacy that made her pulse skip. The carriage ride to Fernleigh was quiet, yet not with the brittle silences of before. Charlotte leaned slightly into Sebastian's arm as the lamps flickered across the moors. He said little, but his hand covered hers, steady and sure, and the warmth of it spoke more than words could. At last she murmured, "Are you prepared for the scrutiny?" "I fear for the scrutiny itself," he said softly, "but not for you." Her heart swelled at the words. Fernleigh House blazed with light. Lanterns lit the carriageway, footmen in livery guiding arrivals to the marble steps. Music spilled through open doors, chandeliers glittered overhead, and the air was alive with laughter, perfume, and the rustle of silk. Charlotte entered upon Sebastian's arm, and at once she felt the ripple of attention. Eyes turned, fans fluttered, whispers began. Lady Ashcombe, in crimson velvet heavy with gold embroidery, swept forward with her smile, as sharp as glass. "Lady Ravensleigh, how transformed you are. One would scarce know you." Charlotte curtsied gracefully. "It seems we all transform, my lady, some more gracefully than others." The smile wavered. Sebastian's lips curved faintly. The evening unfolded in a whirl. Charlotte danced a set with Sebastian, their movements precise, his hand firm yet lingering at her back. Another gentleman claimed her hand for the quadrille, but her gaze found Sebastian's across the room, his eyes steady upon her, and her heart fluttered with the secret knowledge of what lay between them. At supper the tables groaned with abundance. Cold game pies, hams glazed with cloves, jellied fruits, roasted capons, syllabubs frothing in glass, and pyramids of lemon and strawberry ice. Charlotte ate sparingly, her appetite dulled by nerves but steadied by Sebastian's quiet presence. He filled her glass himself, a small gesture that did not go unnoticed by onlookers. "She has him in hand," whispered one guest behind a fan. "Or he, her," murmured another. Charlotte smiled, for once unconcerned. The truth was neither or both. By night's end, as the carriages drew once more into the frost, Charlotte leaned against Sebastian's shoulder in the darkness. "You endured them well," she smiled softly. "I did not endure them. I stood among them. You are stronger than I ever believed." She turned her head, their eyes meeting in the flickering torchlight. "Because I am no longer alone." For a heartbeat he said nothing. Then, gently, he bent and kissed her brow. As the carriage bore them homeward, Charlotte knew the ball had not tested her gown or her grace, so much as the strength of the bond she shared with Sebastian. A bond the world might whisper against, but could no longer shake. Chapter 17. The Invitation. The morning sun fell across the breakfast parlour in golden shafts, gilding the damask cloth and glinting off the silver service. Before her lay a dish of buttered rolls, blackberry preserves, and a soft-boiled egg. She had just broken the egg's top when the butler entered, a letter upon a silver tray. "From London, my lady," he said gravely. Charlotte set down her spoon. The seal, crimson wax stamped with a crest she recognised only from gossip, marked it as no ordinary correspondence. The words swam before her. "The Countess of Ravensleigh is cordially invited to the Marchioness of Wexford's assembly, to be held at Grosvenor Square." Charlotte's breath caught. Grosvenor Square, the heart of the ton. Sebastian entered then, clad in a coat of dark blue superfine, his cravat tied hastily, his boots still bearing the dust of the stables. He paused at the sight of her expression. "What has happened?" She held out the letter. "We are invited to London, to the ton." He took it, his eyes scanning quickly. His jaw tightened. "So, they mean to see you." "See me," she repeated softly. "Or measure me." "Both." Silence fell as the weight of it settled between them. The ton was not like the county's curious gentry, whose whispers could be deflected with a smile. London was merciless. A governess turned countess would be dissected, judged, and perhaps crushed. Charlotte lifted her chin. "We cannot refuse." "We can." She met his gaze steadily. "But if we do, they will say it is because you are ashamed of me." He flinched, as though struck. That afternoon, Mistress Keyes was summoned. Charlotte stood before the mirror in the withdrawing room as fabric was unfurled. A bolt of ivory silk, a length of deep green velvet, a pale pink satin striped with silver. "You must have at least 3 new gowns for the assemblies," the seamstress declared, pins clamped between her lips. A ball gown in white or pale shade, an evening dress in jewel tone, and a visiting gown. Charlotte endured the measuring, the pins, the fussing. Her maid whispered admiration at each fabric chosen, but Charlotte felt the weight of every stitch. These gowns were not garments alone, they were armour for battle. "Pearls will suit you," Mistress Keyes mused. "You have too much natural dignity for gaudy jewels. A string of pearls, and perhaps a fan of ivory." Charlotte nodded, though her heart thudded. That evening, supper was served in the smaller dining parlour. Roast chicken with lemon, buttered peas, and a custard tart for dessert. Charlotte ate little, her mind too full. Sebastian sat across from her, silent until the plates were cleared. At Grosvenor Square, they will not forgive easily. They will see a governess in silks. They will whisper of Ravensleigh's debts. They will remember every fault of my house. "And I," Charlotte said, her voice steady, "will stand among them. Not because I was born to it, but because I am yours." His gaze met hers across the candlelight, raw and searching. "And if they tear you down?" "Then I will rise again, she answered softly, for I have survived worse. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Sebastian leaned back, the tension in his shoulders easing by the smallest degree. Very well, we go to London. Later that night, Charlotte stood before her mirror, brushing her dark hair loose over her shoulders. The gowns would be made, the carriage prepared, the ton awaited. She felt fear. Yes, but also resolve. Ravensleigh had been her first proving ground. London would be her next. As Charlotte set aside the invitation, she knew the path before her was fraught with peril, but to step into the ton was to claim her place at Sebastian's side, whatever the cost of pride. Chapter 18. London Unveiled. The journey to London began an hour before sunrise. Ravensleigh receded behind them in a shroud of mist. Charlotte sat in the carriage, swathed in her travelling cloak of blue wool, lined with fur, her gloves folded neatly in her lap. Beside her, Sebastian leaned back, one arm resting against the window, his expression pensive, yet softened when he glanced at her. The rhythm of the wheels upon the road, the steady sway of the carriage, all reminded Charlotte that this was no ordinary errand. She was leaving not only the countryside but the quiet shelter of her beginnings as Countess. Ahead lay London, the Torn. On the first day they stopped at an inn along the coaching road, where the fare was plain but hearty. A trencher of beef stew with carrots, crusty brown bread, and a small wedge of cheese. Charlotte ate sparingly, the nervous flutter in her stomach leaving little room for appetite. Yet when she set down her spoon, Sebastian reached over, covering her hand with his. "You must eat," he said quietly, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "You will need your strength for London." Her pulse quickened at the small intimacy. "You sound as though we go to battle." "In a way we do," he replied, a wry half-smile touching his lips. The second day's travel was longer. At one stop, Charlotte tasted a venison pasty baked golden and flaky, onions sweet within the filling, and though she laughed at herself for eating so greedily, Sebastian only looked amused. By late afternoon, as the moors gave way to busier roads, Charlotte leaned into him, her head resting lightly against his shoulder. He did not move away, instead he tilted his head and brushed his lips once, gently against her hair. She closed her eyes, letting the comfort of it steady her. The silence between them no longer pressed heavy. It breathed. On the third day, the skyline of London appeared, smoke rising in a restless haze, spires piercing the sky. Charlotte pressed her gloved hand to the carriage window, her breath catching. "It is enormous," she whispered, alive, and yet overwhelming. Sebastian studied her profile, the awe and fear mingling in her gaze. "It can devour the unprepared," he said softly, "but you are not unprepared." Her throat tightened. "I hope you are right." "I am." He reached for her hand, entwining his fingers with hers until the carriage rattled into the streets. Their townhouse on Brook Street awaited them, long shuttered but hastily restored to readiness. Servants bustled, candles glowed in every sconce, carpets freshly beaten, the air tinged with beeswax and coal smoke. Charlotte ascended the staircase, her cloak trailing, to find her chamber arranged with care. The bed turned down, the hearth blazing, and on the mantel, a vase of winter hothouse blooms. Her maid unpacked the gowns with reverence. Charlotte brushed her fingers over them, feeling their richness more keenly here than she ever had in the quiet country. "You will dazzle them, my lady," her maid whispered. Charlotte's smile was faint. "Let us hope they are dazzled enough to forget they once whispered governess." That evening, supper was laid in the dining room, the table gleaming with polished silver and crystal. The fare was delicate, designed to impress without ostentation. Roast capon with lemon, a dish of asparagus forced early in hothouses, and a syllabub served in glass, frothing white and sweet. Charlotte tasted little, her nerves taut. Outside the townhouse, the rumble of London never ceased. Wheels clattering over cobbles, voices shouting, hawkers calling late into the night. Sebastian drank sparingly, his gaze upon her. At last he said, "They will watch you." "I know," Charlotte answered softly. They will weigh your gown, your voice, the very way you lift a fan. They will test you until you falter. She looked at him, her chin steady despite the tremor in her heart. Then let them. I have faltered before, Sebastian. I have risen before, and this time I do not rise alone. Something flickered in his eyes then. Pride, perhaps even admiration. He inclined his head. You are right. Later, when she dismissed her maid and stood before the mirror, Charlotte tried on the ivory satin gown embroidered with pearls, one of her new London dresses. The candlelight gleamed across the fabric, her dark hair a striking contrast. For a moment she hardly recognized herself. But as she gazed, she realized this was not a disguise. This was herself, no longer hidden, no longer shrinking. Behind her, Sebastian entered quietly. He paused, his eyes widening faintly at the sight. You are. He searched for the word, but only shook his head, as though speech had failed him. Charlotte turned slowly, her lips curving. We will face them together, she said. Yes, he replied, his voice low and certain. Together. As Charlotte extinguished her candle that night, the restless hum of London beyond her window, she knew she had stepped into a world dazzling and perilous, and that from this moment forward, every step she took would be with Sebastian at her side. Chapter 19. The Marchioness's Assembly. The night of the assembly arrived at last. Charlotte dressed with careful precision. Her gown was of ivory satin, its skirts full, the bodice trimmed with pearls so fine they gleamed like stars. A narrow sash of silver circled her waist, and her pearl comb shone in the dark sweep of her hair. At her throat, a single string of pearls rested against pale skin. Her gloves were white kid, fitted to the wrist, new and unsullied. Her maid whispered reverently, You look like a queen, my lady. Charlotte's lips curved faintly. Let us hope the ton does not see only a governess in disguise. Sebastian awaited her below, his coat of black velvet perfectly cut, his cravat stark and flawless, his waistcoat a pale shade of grey that lent sharpness to his dark gaze. When she descended the staircase, he stilled, his expression momentarily stripped of composure. You are exquisite, he said simply. She lowered her eyes, her voice soft but steady. Then let them see me as such. Their carriage drew up before the Marchioness's townhouse, its columns lit with torches. A crowd of onlookers pressed near, craning to glimpse the arrivals. Charlotte felt Sebastian's hand cover hers, steadying her as she stepped down. The murmurs began at once, whispers threading through the night. Inside, the assembly rooms glittered with chandeliers, mirrors reflecting endless candlelight. Ladies in gowns of emerald, sapphire and rose swept past, jewels flashing at their throats. Gentlemen in velvet and silk bowed with grave courtesy. The air was heavy with perfume, with heat, with the weight of eyes. The Marchioness herself descended upon Charlotte, her gown of crimson silk rustling, her diamonds blazing. Lady Ravensleigh, she said with a smile sharp as glass. We are honoured at last to welcome you. Charlotte curtsied, graceful and unshaken. The honour is mine, madam. Grosvenor Square is everything I imagined and more. The Marchioness's smile tightened, but she gestured Charlotte forward. Come then, be seen. And so she was. Fans fluttered, whispers rose, eyes measured every detail. The satin, the pearls, the composure that never faltered. Men bowed politely, women smiled with practiced sweetness. Some sneered behind their fans, yet Charlotte met each gaze with calm dignity. She danced a set with Sebastian, his hand firm at her waist, his gaze never leaving hers. As the set reformed, she found herself led into a quadrille by a Mr. Ashford, all polite smiles and careful steps. She was aware without looking that Sebastian watched. At supper, the tables groaned with splendour. Cold pheasants dressed in aspic, pies ornamented with gilded crusts, jellies quivering in crystal moulds. Charlotte did not confine herself to politeness. She accepted what was offered, sampled generously, and discovered that triumph sharpened rather than dulled her appetite. The pheasant was delicately spiced, the syllabub light as air, the tart bright with citrus. She tasted it all and enjoyed it. She conversed with easy assurance, asking after estates, praising charities, laughing with warmth that invited confidence rather than sought approval. She did not hover at the margins of the table. She occupied her place as though she had always known it was hers. "She carries herself with grace," murmured one matron behind a fan. "And with courage," whispered another. By night's end, when the carriages once more clattered into the frost, Charlotte leaned back against the seat, weary yet alight. Sebastian studied her, his voice low. "You silenced them." She smiled faintly. Not silenced, only met them. He reached for her hand, clasping it firmly in the dim light. "You astonish me." She turned her face toward him, her heart steady. "Then let me astonish them all." As the carriage bore them back through London's glittering streets, Charlotte knew the Marchioness's assembly had been no mere gathering. It was a battlefield, and she had emerged not unscathed, but victorious. Chapter 20. Scandal's Shadow. London did not forget easily. Charlotte soon learned that while the tongue could be dazzled for an evening, it was envy that gave their tongues true sharpness. In the days after Grosvenor Square, invitations multiplied. Routes, music assemblies, carriage rides in Hyde Park. Charlotte accepted them with grace, knowing refusal would be read as weakness. Each time she stepped into a gown, pale green satin trimmed with ivory lace, rose silk striped faintly with gold, white tulle scattered with silver spangles, she felt the weight of every gaze upon her. Some softened with admiration, others sharpened with suspicion. Sebastian attended each event at her side, his presence commanding, his glances toward her increasingly protective. Yet even he could not silence every whisper. The route at Lady Fairchild's townhouse was the most splendid yet. Chandeliers blazed from the ceiling, musicians in the gallery played with fevered bows, and the crush of guests filled every corner. The air shimmered with perfume, sweat, and the rustle of silks. Charlotte entered the ballroom at Sebastian's side, her gown of pale jonquil silk gauze floating about her like captured candlelight. The high-waisted bodice, delicately ruched across the bust, was fashioned with a softly rounded neckline and short sleeves trimmed in fine Brussels lace. Beneath the translucent gauze lay a richer underdress of primrose satin, lending depth and warmth to the colour so that it glowed against her complexion. A narrow sash of deeper gold silk was tied just below her bosom, its long ends trailing almost to the hem. The skirt fell in light, airy folds that stirred with every movement, catching the shimmer of the chandeliers far more playfully than satin ever could. She wore long gloves of pale kid and a slender gold chain about her throat, from which hung a small topaz that echoed the hue of her gown. In her dark curls, a spray of natural jonquils added a touch of spring freshness, subtle yet unmistakably new to those who had marked her appearance at the last assembly. She felt Sebastian's hand, steady at her back, guiding her through the throng, and though her pulse raced, she lifted her chin and moved with serene dignity. Yet almost at once, she caught the whispers. There she is, the governess. A governess. And now she presumes to preside as Countess. It is said Ravensleigh's coffers were empty, and he took her out of desperation. Charlotte's breath quickened. She had expected envy, but the venom in the words pierced. She did not falter outwardly. She would not, but her heart ached. Sebastian heard them too. His jaw tightened, his gaze darkened, and for a moment Charlotte feared he would whirl upon the offenders and deliver a set-down that would echo through London. Instead, his hand pressed more firmly at her back. "Say the word," he murmured low, "and I will take you away from this rabble." She turned her face slightly. "No. If we leave, they win. Let them whisper." "I shall remain." For a moment, his eyes searched hers. Then he inclined his head, grudgingly, as though granting command of a battlefield. "Very well, but you do not stand alone." They made their way to supper, where tables groaned beneath lavish abundance. Silver and crystal glittered beneath the lights, every dish a testament to extravagance. There was a grand tureen of turtle soup, steaming rich and fragrant, a platter of salmon dressed with cucumber. its flesh blushing pink against the porcelain, a brace of pheasants roasted crisp and golden, garnished with sprigs of thyme, and veal olives rolled with herbs and breadcrumbs, gleaming in their sauce. Around them stood pyramids of candied oranges and apricots, almond jellies moulded into delicate shapes, and a tall trifle layered with sponge, custard and ruby-coloured jelly. At the centre, upon a raised stand, an ornamental sugarwork creation, a swan spun entirely of white sugar, delicate as lace, drew gasps of admiration. Charlotte's fork lay idle more often than not, though she offered every necessary compliment with unruffled grace. Lady Ashcombe descended upon her, resplendent in violet velvet, heavy with amethysts. Her smile did not reach her eyes. "Lady Ravensleigh," she purred, "you astonish me yet again. To think one who once taught children their letters now commands a table such as this." Charlotte's pulse quickened, but she met the older woman's gaze steadily, her voice cool yet kind. "It seems teaching letters was good preparation, my lady. After all, society is nothing more than learning a new alphabet, and I am an apt pupil." For a breath, silence hung. Then laughter rippled nearby, polite yet unmistakable. Lady Ashcombe's smile faltered, and she withdrew with stiff grace. Sebastian watched her, approval clear in his expression. "You wield words as weapons, better than I ever could." She smiled, though her hands trembled faintly beneath the tablecloth. The rest of the route passed in a blur of music and chatter, the dance floor swirling with gowns of scarlet, emerald and gold. Charlotte danced twice, her steps precise, her smile unshaken, yet each whisper she overheard, governess, desperation, scandal, settled like frost upon her heart. It was only in the carriage home that she allowed her shoulders to sag. The lamps flickered against the glass, casting Sebastian's face in shifting shadow. "You should not have to bear it," he said fiercely. "Their cruelty, their envy. I would shield you from it if I could." Charlotte leaned into him then, her head resting upon his shoulder. "I do not ask to be shielded, Sebastian, only to stand beside you." His arm came around her, drawing her close. "Beside me then. Always." She closed her eyes, hearing the steady thrum of his heartbeat, and for the first time the whispers seemed far away, powerless against the warmth between them. As the carriage wheels carried them through the lamplit streets, Charlotte knew Scandal's shadow would follow her always, but with Sebastian's hand around hers, she felt ready to walk unafraid into the heart of the ton. Epilogue. The Countess's Legacy. Spring unfurled gently across the moors, softening the edges of Ravensleigh's wild beauty. Where frost had once claimed the hedgerows, violets now pushed through, their scent drifting on the breeze. The great house itself gleamed with new life, windows shone with polish, fires glowed cheerfully, and the sound of voices, of servants at work, of laughter echoing in halls once silent, made it a place reborn. Charlotte walked the morning gallery with her infant in her arms. The baby girl stirred, curls dark as her mother's, eyes a clear grey blue that seemed to mirror Sebastian's gaze. She wore a tiny gown of white lawn trimmed with the narrowest lace, sewn by Charlotte's maid with loving care. "Anna," Charlotte whispered, brushing her lips against the child's soft temple. "Our Anna." The name still felt like a miracle when spoken aloud. She had dreamed of belonging, of building a home, and now that dream cooed softly against her shoulder, as real and warm as spring itself. Sebastian joined her in the gallery, his stride quiet, his presence filling the long corridor. He wore a charcoal greatcoat, his cravat tied carelessly, his hair ruffled as though sleep had been forsaken for pacing at dawn, yet his expression softened as his eyes fell upon Charlotte and the child. "She grows by the hour," he murmured, brushing a hand against Anna's tiny fist. "Your impatience will not make her taller," Charlotte teased, smiling. "Not taller," he said, pressing a kiss to Charlotte's hair, "but perhaps stronger. She will have your patience, and my stubbornness. God help the world." Charlotte laughed softly, leaning into his embrace. A week later, the parish bells rang out across the valley, not in mourning, but in joy. Their peal echoed from the hills like laughter, like light. The villagers gathered in their Sunday best, flowers braided into hair, arms full of baskets heavy with cider, bread and orchard preserves. Ravensleigh's carriages gleamed in the golden light, their lacquered sides polished to perfection, bearing the family to a wedding none had dared imagine. Inside the ivy-covered church, Marianne stood at the altar, no longer the wan figure hidden away in the east wing, but a woman reborn. Her gown was of lavender muslin, soft and fresh as a spring breeze, and her bonnet, trimmed in violets, framed a face both serene and luminous. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer, aching wonder of it all. Then he reached for her, the country doctor, her doctor. His hands, steady and warm, folded over hers as if he'd been waiting his whole life to hold them like this. He wore no fine coat, no aristocratic pretense, just a well-brushed suit and eyes that held nothing back. Devotion, gratitude, something dangerously close to awe. "Beloved," he said, as he spoke his vows, "from sorrow we are made tender. From tenderness, joy is born." Charlotte sat in the front pew, Anna nestled in her arms, her heart swelling as Marianne's voice, faint but sure, repeated the words of matrimony. Sebastian's hand rested upon her shoulder, warm and steady, his expression unreadable yet softened by relief. When Marianne spoke the final "I do," the church filled with light, as though every candle burned brighter. Outside in the churchyard, tables were laid with food, loaves of fresh bread still warm, wheels of cheese wrapped in linen, honey cakes spiced with nutmeg, strawberries preserved in syrup, flagons of cider and ale. Villagers pressed close, offering congratulations, raising cups in toasts. Charlotte nibbled a slice of honey cake while cradling Anna, who reached with eager hands toward the sugared crust. "Not yet, little one," she murmured, laughing. Beside her, Sebastian accepted a tankard from an old farmer who clapped his shoulder as though they had long been equals. For the first time, Sebastian accepted the gesture without flinching. Ravensleigh was no longer a fortress against shame. It was a hearth for community. Marianne stood nearby, the doctor's arm steady around her. She looked uncertain at moments, her gaze sometimes drifting, but each time his hand squeezed hers. Clarity returned. She smiled. A fragile smile, but a real one. "She will be cared for now," Sebastian said quietly. Charlotte turned to him, her eyes luminous. "And so will you. For all these years, you carried her sorrow as your own. Now she carries joy instead." He exhaled slowly, as though laying down a weight. Yes, at last. That evening, back at Ravensleigh, Charlotte laid Anna in her cradle. The fire burned low, the shadows soft and welcoming. She smoothed the infant's gown and stood watching until the child's breaths grew even. Sebastian joined her, his coat removed, his cravat loosened. He slipped an arm around her waist, drawing her close, as they stood before the cradle. "We have come far," he said quietly. Charlotte leaned against him. "And we have further still to go, but no longer alone." He turned, pressing a kiss to her temple. "No, never alone." As moonlight silvered the cradle and bells tolled faintly from the village below, Charlotte knew that sorrow had not vanished, but had been remade into love, into strength, into a life anew, and that Ravensleigh would endure, carried forward by the family who now called it home. The years thereafter. Time, which once had seemed an adversary, proved instead a gentle ally. It moved not in storms but in seasons. Spring brought sons, 2 boys with dark hair like their father, and eyes bright with mischief and promise. They raced through Ravensleigh's galleries with wooden swords, their laughter echoing where once only silence had lingered. Sebastian pretended sternness when they scaled the banisters, yet Charlotte more than once caught him hiding a smile as he taught them to ride across the moors, small boots determined in the stirrups. Anna, solemn and protective as an elder sister, read to them by the fire in winter evenings, her voice as steady as her mother's beside her. Ravensleigh no longer felt vast and wounded, it felt alive, and as the children grew, so too did the house. Summer lengthened the boys into men. One inherited the title with steady dignity, the other chose a life beyond the estate, yet returned often, laughter filling the halls. Anna married well and wisely, bringing children of her own to race beneath the carved falcons above the great doors. Marianne, too, found her peace. The doctor's steadfast patience proved stronger than grief, and though memory would always leave its tender mark, she no longer walked in shadow. She came often to Ravensleigh, her step sure, her smile gentle, her hand resting easily in her husband's. The east wing, once sealed in sorrow, stood open to light and air, not forgotten, but forgiven. The villagers no longer whispered, they nodded, with respect. Ravensleigh had not merely endured, it had flourished. Autumn came gently. Charlotte's dark hair softened to silver, though her eyes remained unchanged, clear, perceptive, quietly brave. Sebastian's stride slowed, his once unyielding shoulders easing with time, yet his gaze when it rested upon her had lost none of its depth. They often stood together at the gallery window in the evenings, watching smoke curl from cottages across the valley, the land stretching wide and steadfast beneath a fading sky. One such evening, as winter silvered the fields, Sebastian reached for her hand. "Do you regret it?" he asked softly. She knew what he meant. The ballroom, the corridor, the desperate proposal spoken without tenderness. Charlotte turned to him, her fingers tightening in his. Never. He studied her for a long moment, not as a man measuring necessity, nor as a husband guarding pride, but as one who had learned, slowly and at great cost, what love required. "I once told you," he said quietly, "that I required a wife." The faintest smile touched her lips. "Yes." His voice deepened, steadier now than it had been on that long-ago evening. "I was wrong." Her breath caught. "I did not require a wife," he continued. "I required you." The years fell away in that moment. The silence, the sorrow, the locked door, the whispered scandal. Charlotte rose on her toes and pressed her forehead gently against his. "And you had me," she whispered. "From the beginning." Below them, grandchildren's laughter drifted bright and fearless through the hall. The falcons above the door kept silent watch, their wings carved in stone, unbroken. And in the quiet strength of Ravensleigh, no longer shadowed, no longer secret, the Earl and his bride stood together, not bound by necessity, nor defined by the past, but joined by a love chosen freely, again and again. And at last, they were home. And so, Ravensleigh rests, no longer shadowed, but whole. If you enjoyed this marriage of convenience, another awaits. The reluctant Countess is waiting for you now. A quiet heroine, a brooding lord, and a love neither intended. Tap the video on your screen to continue listening. I shall return soon with another romance, unless I've been spirited away by moonlight and mischief.